Thanksgiving had always been one of my favorite holidays, not because of the food, though I loved a good plate of turkey and stuffing, but because of the meaning behind it. Gratitude, family, coming together despite differences. My late wife and I built our whole family tradition around it, making sure no one felt left out. For decades I hosted every year, even when money was tight. I roasted the turkey, set the table, and watched the kids laugh in the living room while football played in the background. It was noisy, messy, sometimes chaotic, but it was family. This year was different. My daughter-in-law Kelly had insisted on hosting. She said it was time for the younger generation to take over, and though I didn't like the thought of giving up my role, I didn't fight it. I baked one of my wife's old recipes, a pecan pie she used to make, and told myself it would be good to just sit back and watch my son's family carry the tradition forward. I drove over with the pie on the passenger seat, the warm smell filling the car, giving me a strange sense of comfort. When I pulled up, the driveway was already crowded with cars. Neighbors, friends, extended family, they were all there. I carried the pie carefully, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the house. Through the window I could see people laughing, holding drinks, passing plates. My heart lifted. Maybe this year would be a good one after all. I hadn't even reached the door when it opened. Kelly stood there, blocking the entrance. She didn't smile. Instead, she looked at me the way someone might look at a stranger who'd shown up uninvited. "Oh," she said flatly, glancing down at the pie in my hands. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I forced a small smile. "Of course I came. It's Thanksgiving. I wouldn't miss it." She crossed her arms. "Look, I don't know how else to say this, but you're kind of a downer, and we don't need that today. The kids pick up on your mood, and honestly, it's depressing. I think it's better if you just head home." For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. My ears rang, my grip tightening on the pie dish. I tried to laugh it off. "Kelly, it's Thanksgiving. I brought dessert. I don't understand." She cut me off, her voice sharper now. "It's not personal. It's just you bring the energy down. You always sit quietly in the corner, and it makes everyone uncomfortable. This is supposed to be a happy day. We don't need you killing the vibe." Behind her I could hear laughter, the clinking of glasses, the warmth of family togetherness. Everything I thought I was walking into, but I wasn't welcome. My own son was nowhere in sight, and Kelly stood firm in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame as if guarding the house from me. I swallowed hard. My chest tightened. All I could manage was a whisper. I just wanted to be with my family. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, she looked relieved to have finally said it out loud. "You'll be fine. It's just one meal. We'll catch up another time." Another time. The words were a slap, as if I were some distant acquaintance who could be rescheduled, like a delivery that hadn't fit into today's plans. I stood there frozen, pie trembling in my hands. For years I had carried this family, paid bills, covered emergencies, kept the roof over their heads more times than I could count, and yet in this moment, I was nothing more than an inconvenience. A few guests walked past the doorway, glancing at me with awkward smiles before quickly looking away. No one said a word. No one invited me in. I felt the sting of humiliation burning hot across my face. I wanted to argue, to force my way inside, to shout that I belonged there more than anyone else, but instead I looked down at the pie. My wife's recipe, the last thing I could still do to keep her spirit alive, and I knew it wasn't wanted. My voice cracked as I said, "Happy Thanksgiving." Then I turned, clutching the pie like a lifeline, and walked back down the path. The cold November air hit me, sharper than before. My car was parked at the end of the driveway, and every step toward it felt heavier, as though gravity itself had doubled. I could still hear laughter spilling out of the house, muffled by walls that no longer felt like mine. When I reached the car, I set the pie on the roof and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. My reflection in the window caught my eye. I looked tired, older than I remembered, and deeply alone. For a long moment I stood there, staring at my reflection, hearing the echo of her words. "You're depressing. We don't need you here." I climbed inside, started the engine, and sat in silence. My chest hurt, not from age but from the kind of pain you feel when you realize you've been erased from your own family's story. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Then slowly, a thought settled in. If they believed I was nothing, if they thought I was irrelevant, then maybe it was time to remind them exactly who had been holding them up all these years. As I pulled away from the house, the pie slid across the passenger seat, untouched. The laughter from inside faded behind me, but in my mind, the sting of exclusion burned brighter than ever, and that was the moment everything changed. I drove around for a while after leaving their house, not sure where to go. The streets were quiet, most people inside with their families, sitting around tables full of food and laughter. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I passed house after house glowing with warm yellow light. Inside those homes, fathers were carving turkeys, kids were sneaking bites of pie before dinner, and families were raising their glasses in gratitude. I should have been one of them. Instead, I was out in the cold, rejected from my own son's table. Eventually, I parked at the small diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered open above the door. I had eaten there 1,000 times before, mostly breakfasts when I didn't feel like cooking, or late-night coffee after long shifts. Tonight it felt like a place where no one would ask questions. I walked in, set the pie down on the counter, and slid into a booth. The waitress, an older woman who'd seen me there plenty of times, poured me a cup of coffee without asking. "Not with the family tonight?" she asked gently. I forced a smile. "Something like that." She nodded and walked away, not pressing me further. That was the thing about diners. You could sit there all night with a cup of coffee and no one would care. Still, I could feel the stares of a few other customers. A man eating alone on Thanksgiving told its own story. And I hated that they could see me this way, abandoned, unwanted, sitting alone while the rest of the world celebrated. I stirred the coffee, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The humiliation replayed in my mind like a cruel loop, her voice, sharp and dismissive. "You're depressing. We don't need you here." It wasn't just that she said it. It was that she said it without shame, without hesitation in front of others. As if my exclusion was something to be proud of. A family walked in a few minutes later. The father carried his youngest daughter on his shoulders, and she giggled as he set her down. The mother carried a casserole dish wrapped in foil, probably heading to someone else's house after grabbing a drink. I couldn't look at them for long. It was too much of a reminder of what I'd lost. I thought about turning back, about walking into that house and demanding a seat at the table. But then I remembered the faces of those relatives, the neighbors, the way they glanced at me in the doorway and quickly looked away. They didn't protest when Kelly turned me out. They didn't call after me. They were content to let me walk away carrying a pie like some foolish old man who hadn't realized his place. That wasn't a mistake I was going to repeat. My phone buzzed. A message from a cousin who was at the dinner. It read, "Sorry about what happened. I don't agree with her, but it's not my place to interfere. Hope you're okay. Not your place." The words stung almost as much as Kelly's had. Everyone had decided I didn't matter enough to defend. They might whisper sympathy later, but in the moment, no one had the courage to stand up for me. I took a long sip of the bitter coffee, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't just feel sad. I felt angry. Angry at the disrespect. Angry at how easily they erased me. Angry at my own silence all these years, letting them pretend their success was built without me. I left a few bills on the counter and walked out, the cold air hitting me hard again. This time I didn't head home. I drove past their neighborhood slowly, almost daring someone to notice me. Through the window I saw them raising glasses, my son laughing beside his wife. She whispered something in his ear and they both laughed, and then it happened, the moment that sealed it all. A neighbor, someone I had known for years, spotted me in the car. He gave a small wave, then quickly pulled his hand back and hurried inside. He didn't want to be seen acknowledging me. That cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just Kelly's rejection, it was the quiet agreement of everyone else. By shutting me out publicly, she had branded me as something shameful, something to be avoided. My absence wasn't questioned, it was enforced. I gripped the steering wheel, watching them through the glass, and realized something important. I couldn't fight my way back into that house. I couldn't force myself into a place where I was no longer welcome. But what I could do, what I would do, was remind them that everything they bragged about, everything they flaunted, everything they believed they had built for themselves, was mine. As I pulled away from the curb, my humiliation began to harden into resolve. They thought they had silenced me with one cruel sentence, but what they didn't know was that silence has its own kind of power, and mine was about to speak louder than they ever imagined. As I drove home that night, the anger in my chest burned hotter than the coffee I had left untouched at the diner. But underneath the anger there was something heavier, something that had been building for years, a weight made of memories, sacrifices, and choices that no one seemed to remember anymore. It all came back to me as the streetlights blurred past the windshield. I remembered the long years of working double shifts at the plant, the smell of grease clinging to my clothes, and the ache in my back that never really went away. I didn't work those hours for myself. I did it so my son Mark would have opportunities I never had. He wanted to go to college, and I made sure he got there. I drained my savings, skipped repairs on my own home, and quietly sold off the small fishing boat I loved just to cover his tuition. When Mark graduated, I thought he'd understand the price I had paid. Instead, he seemed embarrassed to mention where the money had come from. At his graduation party, I overheard him telling his friends, "Yeah, I worked hard to get through school." He left out the part where his father had worked himself sick to pay for it. I didn't correct him. I told myself he was just proud. Then came the house. When Mark and Kelly got married, They wanted something bigger than the starter apartment they could afford. Kelly insisted on a 2-story home in a new neighborhood with granite countertops and a big backyard. Mark called me late one night, his voice full of strain, asking if I could co-sign the mortgage. I didn't hesitate. Not only did I co-sign, but when the bank pushed back, I put down the money myself to make sure they got approved. I told myself it was what family did. A father helps his son get started. That was my role. But helping them didn't stop there. When Kelly's car broke down, I handed over mine and bought myself a used truck with cash. When they wanted to remodel the kitchen, I quietly transferred funds from my retirement account so they could have what they called a home they could be proud of. I thought pride came from working for something. They thought it came from granite and stainless steel. The sacrifices added up. My knees gave out before I hit 60, but instead of getting them replaced like the doctor advised, I put off the surgery to cover the down payment on their second car. When Mark lost his job for a year, it was me who covered their bills, and when they finally got back on their feet, they didn't thank me. They told everyone how they managed to get through tough times on their own. I swallowed it all, year after year. I told myself it didn't matter if anyone else knew. I knew. I was a father, and a father's job was to make sure his children stood tall, even if it meant bending his own back until it broke. But sitting in my car outside their Thanksgiving dinner, unwanted and dismissed, I realized something. They had rewritten history so thoroughly that even I had started to forget the truth. To them, I was just the quiet old man who sat in the corner, who didn't talk much, who made people uncomfortable. They didn't see the years I had given away to keep them afloat. They didn't see the paychecks I handed over, the meals I skipped, the nights I worked when I should have been sleeping. I thought about my late wife. She used to warn me, in her gentle way, that I gave too much. Don't empty yourself completely, or they'll forget how much you're worth, she once told me. I laughed it off then, certain she was wrong. Family doesn't forget. Children remember. Love always circles back, but she had been right. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, I could almost hear her voice. Not angry, not bitter, just sad. You see it now, don't you? Yes, I saw it. Every sacrifice I had made had turned invisible, erased by their version of events. In their story, I wasn't the man who had built their life. I was the man who was dragging it down. And the cruelest part, they believed it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my daughter-in-law's words hadn't just excluded me from a holiday meal. They had branded me as irrelevant, as disposable. She hadn't said, "You're not welcome tonight." She had said, "You don't belong at all." That was the moment when something inside me hardened. For years I had let them shape the story. I had kept silent, thinking my silence was noble. But silence, I realized, had given them permission to erase me. No more. The pie beside me on the seat shifted as I turned down my street. The smell of pecans and sugar filling the car again. My wife's recipe. Her legacy. It hit me then. I wasn't the one who had failed. They had failed me. And maybe it was time they learned that everything they had, the house, the cars, the comfort they flaunted, wasn't theirs. It was mine. Built on my back. Funded by my sacrifices. They thought I was depressing. They thought I was irrelevant. They thought I was expendable. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning I woke up with a heaviness that coffee couldn't wash away. My house was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the old clock ticking on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the table staring at the untouched pie still sitting in its dish and felt that sting of humiliation again. But what cut deeper than the exclusion itself was the realization that my family had been rewriting the story of my life right in front of me, and I had let them. It hadn't started at Thanksgiving. No, this false narrative had been building for years, brick by brick, whispered at barbecues, murmured at birthdays, hinted at during Christmas dinners. Slowly, the truth of my sacrifices had been replaced by a shiny new story, one that made me a footnote, a supporting character in a play where they were the stars. I remembered one 4th of July, sitting in their backyard. Kelly was talking to some neighbors about the house, about how much work it took to get approved for the mortgage. She waved her hand toward Mark proudly and said, "He worked so hard to get us here. He built this life from the ground up." I had sat there in my lawn chair, beer in hand, wanting to speak, wanting to remind her that without my savings, without my name on those papers, they would still be in a cramped apartment. But I didn't. I swallowed the words. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. And it didn't stop there. At Mark's promotion party, one of his coworkers congratulated him, and I overheard my son say, "Yeah, I did it on my own. Nobody ever gave me a handout." I had nearly choked on my drink. Nobody gave him a handout. I had worked my whole life to make sure he had those so-called opportunities. But again, I said nothing. I smiled. I let the moment pass. The story they were weaving wasn't just about erasing me. It was about painting me as something less. At family gatherings, when I did speak up, I'd notice the quick glances exchanged between Kelly and Mark, as if I was out of touch, as if I didn't understand how the world worked anymore. They would change the subject, talk louder, drown me out with stories of their latest purchases or vacations. I became background noise in my own family. The worst was the time Kelly joked, half serious, half smirking, that I was lucky they still invited me around because old people can be such a drag. Everyone laughed, including my son. I forced a chuckle, but inside, I was bleeding. They were no longer just ignoring my sacrifices, they were mocking me for existing. That's how the false narrative works. First, they erase your contributions, then they redefine you as unnecessary. Finally, they label you as a burden. It's a slow erosion, like waves wearing away at stone. By the time you notice, the shoreline has already changed, and I had let it happen. My wife would have never allowed it. She was the one who kept the family honest, who reminded everyone of where we came from. But since she passed, I had slipped into silence, convincing myself that keeping peace was better than demanding respect. I thought love was enough to bind us, that gratitude didn't need to be spoken out loud, but silence doesn't protect you, it buries you. That Thanksgiving night had been the final act in their play. By telling me I was depressing, Kelly had done more than shut the door in my face. She had declared me officially irrelevant to the story of their lives. And the worst part was, nobody argued. Nobody said, "Wait, he belongs here." They let it happen. I sat at my table staring at the pie, my wife's recipe, and thought about all the lies stacked against me. Lies about how Mark built his life without help. Lies about how Kelly's sacrifices were the reason they had comfort. Lies that made me the shadow at the edge of their spotlight. But I wasn't a shadow. I was the foundation. And here was the truth they didn't know. The mortgage, the savings, the loans, the co-signed papers, all of it still had my name attached. Legally, financially, practically, I wasn't just part of their story. I was the one who had written it. I leaned back in my chair and let the anger settle into something sharper. Cold. Focused. For years I had been silent while they twisted the story. But stories are fragile things. They can be rewritten, and I was done letting them hold the pen. If they wanted to erase me, if they wanted to act as though I didn't exist, then I would give them exactly what they asked for. They would learn what life without me really looked like. The pie sat there on the counter, untouched, a symbol of everything they thought they didn't need anymore. I picked it up, slid it into the trash, and closed the lid. That was the last thing I would give them for free. In the days after Thanksgiving, I didn't call my son. I didn't answer the texts from a few relatives who wrote weak apologies, telling me they hoped there weren't hard feelings. I didn't bother explaining myself or defending my place in the family. I knew by then that words meant nothing. Words were the tools they had used against me, twisting, erasing, reshaping the truth. So I decided to stop talking altogether. I moved through my life quietly. I went about my routines, making coffee in the morning, reading the paper, walking down to the corner store. But inside, something had shifted. My silence wasn't born from shame anymore. It was deliberate, strategic. For the first time in years, I wasn't swallowing my pride just to keep the peace. I was holding it back like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment. At first they mistook my silence for surrender. Kelly posted photos from Thanksgiving on social media, pictures of the long dining table filled with smiling faces. I wasn't in a single shot. In one caption she wrote, "So blessed for family who lift us up." I stared at those words on my screen, my jaw tightening. She had no idea how ironic they were. Without me, there would have been no house to host that meal in, no credit cards to buy those groceries, no steady ground for her to plant her image of a perfect life. But I didn't comment. I didn't correct. I let her enjoy her illusion. My son too must have assumed I'd sulk for a few days and then come crawling back with forgiveness. He sent me a message. "Hey Dad, let's put Thanksgiving behind us. You know how Kelly gets stressed with hosting. Don't take it personal. Don't take it personal." The words made me laugh bitterly. It was personal. She had looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in my own family, and now he wanted me to pretend it was nothing more than a misunderstanding. No, not this time. I didn't reply. Silence became my answer, and it rattled them more than I expected. A week passed, then two. I noticed the shift in their voices when they did call, the edge of unease creeping in. Kelly left me a voicemail, her tone lighter, forced cheer. "We'd love to have you over for dinner sometime. Maybe we can start fresh." But I didn't respond, because while they filled the silence with excuses and half-hearted invitations, I was busy preparing. I went into the attic one afternoon and dug out the metal box I had kept hidden for years. Inside were folders stuffed with papers, mortgage deeds, bank transfers, signed agreements. Every sacrifice I had made for them was right there in black and white. I spread the papers out across my dining table. the documents rustling like whispers of the past. Here was the loan I had taken against my retirement fund to cover their down payment. Here were the receipts for the tuition checks I had written. Here was the letter from the bank showing my name on the mortgage. They might have erased me from their stories, but they couldn't erase my handwriting. The silence gave me clarity. For years I had fought for scraps of recognition, a thank you here, a nod there. And what had it earned me? A daughter-in-law who sneered that I was depressing, a son who let her, a family who watched me walk away without a word. Now I didn't need their recognition. What I needed was to remind them of reality, to show them that without me their world didn't stand. So I stopped showing up. No casual visits, no small talk on the phone, no offers to help with bills. I let the silence stretch longer, like a rope pulling tight. They had grown so used to me being invisible that they hadn't realized how much they relied on me. That was about to change. One evening I received another message from Mark. His voice sounded strained this time. "Dad, are you okay? I noticed you haven't been around. The bank sent me something weird about the mortgage. Can we talk?" I sat in my chair listening to his voice on the answering machine and let it play out. He sounded confused, nervous. The first crack in their confidence had appeared, and still, I didn't call back. Strategic silence isn't about weakness, it's about control. Every day I held my tongue, I felt my power growing. They thought they had silenced me at Thanksgiving. They thought I was irrelevant. But the truth was, my silence was louder than any words I could have spoken. It was the silence of a man who no longer begged to be seen. The silence of a father who was done giving everything for nothing. The silence of someone who had the power to end the lies, and was patient enough to wait for the perfect moment, and that moment was coming. When I was a younger man, I used to think strength was measured by how loud you could shout, how hard you could push back in a fight. But age teaches you something different. True strength doesn't need to raise its voice. It just waits, steady and quiet, until the right time to strike. That was the lesson I leaned on after Thanksgiving. While my son and his wife laughed in their warm house and I sat alone with stacks of cold paper, I realized I held something more powerful than their approval: proof. I had kept every record, every receipt, every agreement over the years, not because I thought I'd need them, but because old habits die hard. My father used to tell me, paperwork is proof of a man's life. So I had always filed things away neatly, never throwing out important documents. Now those old boxes were my arsenal. I started pulling everything out: file folders, envelopes, bank statements that stretched back decades. At first it felt overwhelming, like trying to piece together a puzzle without knowing what the final picture was supposed to look like. But slowly, I began to see it clearly. The mortgage papers were first. I unfolded the thick packet and ran my finger down the signatures. There it was, my name printed alongside my son's. Without me co-signing, they never would have gotten that house. Without my down payment, the bank would have laughed them out the door. That house wasn't just theirs, it was mine. Next, I pulled out tuition records, thousands of dollars in checks I had written directly to the university. Each one bore my shaky signature, each one stamped paid. My son had stood on a graduation stage and claimed he made it on his own, but these checks told a different story. Then came the car loans, the credit card bailouts, the bank transfers I had made late at night when they called me crying about bills they couldn't pay. Every one of them documented, every one of them tied to me. I stacked the papers in neat piles across my dining table. The proof was everywhere. For years I had believed my sacrifices disappeared the moment they left my hands, but the truth was, paper remembers even when people don't. Still, I needed more than just records. I needed leverage, something that couldn't be brushed aside as old help or gifts, something legally binding. That's when I remembered the loan agreement. Years ago, when they remodeled their kitchen, I had insisted on writing up a simple contract before handing over the money. They laughed at me then, thought I was being dramatic, but I held my ground. I wrote out the terms in plain language, and both of them signed it. It wasn't notarized, but it was still enforceable, and I still had the original. I pulled the document out of its envelope, the ink slightly faded but still clear. Their signatures stared back at me, undeniable proof that they acknowledged the debt. My lips curled into a thin smile. That was the kind of paper no false narrative could erase. But even with all this, I knew I couldn't act alone. I needed someone who understood the weight of these papers, someone who could turn proof into power. So I picked up the phone and called Tom. Tom was a retired accountant, an old friend from my factory days. We'd shared more than a few beers after long shifts, and though we didn't see each other often now, I trusted him. He came by the next day, his eyes widening as he saw the mountain of paperwork spread across my table. "Good Lord, John," he muttered, shaking his head. "You kept all of this?" "Every scrap," I said, "and now I think it's time I use it." He sat down and started leafing through the stacks. His trained eyes moved quickly, scanning dates, signatures, Amounts. After a long silence, he looked up at me, his expression serious. "They've built their whole life on your back," he said, "and you've got the paperwork to prove it. If you wanted to, you could pull the rug right out from under them. That's exactly what I intend to do." For hours, we organized everything into folders, mortgage documents in one, tuition payments in another, car loans, bank transfers, and that kitchen loan agreement, all lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Tom even helped me draft a simple ledger, tallying the amounts. When we finished, the total made my stomach twist. It was more than I had realized, more than I should have ever given without demanding accountability. "They owe you their entire life," Tom said quietly. I nodded. "And yet they told me I was depressing, that I wasn't needed." The anger flared again, but this time it was cleaner, sharper. Not the raw humiliation I felt on Thanksgiving night, but the steady fire of a man who finally saw the truth in front of him. Still, I knew anger alone wouldn't win this fight. What I needed was patience, timing. I couldn't just storm over to their house and slam the papers on the table. That would only give them a chance to twist the story again, to paint me as bitter, vindictive. No, if I was going to act, it had to be in a way that left no room for denial. So I bided my time. I kept my silence. I let them believe I was sulking, fading away into the background. Meanwhile, I stored the papers neatly in a new box, one I kept locked in my cabinet. Every night I would sit with a cup of tea and read through them again. Not because I doubted what I had, but because I wanted to remember. I wanted to burn every sacrifice into my memory, to remind myself why I was doing this. They thought I was weak. They thought I was irrelevant. They thought my silence meant defeat. But silence was just the cover. Proof was the weapon, and when the time came, I would wield it with precision. Black Friday was approaching, and while the rest of the world planned their shopping sprees, I was planning something far darker. When you've spent years being dismissed, ignored, and quietly erased, you start to doubt yourself. That's the hardest part. It isn't just the cruelty of others. It's the way their voices start to echo in your head, making you wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you are a burden. Maybe you don't matter as much as you thought. That's where I was after Thanksgiving. Even with the pile of proof sitting on my table, mortgage papers, tuition checks, loan agreements, there was still a voice inside whispering, "What if none of this changes anything? What if you're just clinging to scraps?" Then Tom came along. I've known Tom nearly all my life. We met at the plant back when we were both young men with strong backs and empty wallets. We worked side by side for 30 years, clocking in before dawn, clocking out when the sun was already gone. We weren't just co-workers. We were brothers in every way that counted. He knew me when I was a husband, a father, a provider. He knew the kind of man I was before the years wore me down. When I called him after Thanksgiving, I didn't even have to explain much. I just told him, "I need someone to look over some papers," and without hesitation he said, "I'll be there." He showed up the next day, carrying a leather satchel and that same no-nonsense attitude he'd always had. His hair was whiter now, and his knees creaked when he sat down, but his eyes were sharp as ever. I spread the documents across the table, and he took his time looking through them. For hours, the only sounds in the room were the rustle of papers and the scratching of his pen as he made notes. I sat there watching him, my stomach tight with a mix of hope and dread. Finally, he set his pen down and looked me straight in the eye. "John," he said, "you're not crazy. You're not imagining this. You've carried these people for years, and here's the proof. Without you, they'd have nothing, and instead of respecting that, they've been treating you like you don't exist." I can't describe the relief I felt in that moment, to have someone validate what I already knew deep down. It was like a weight sliding off my chest. For so long I'd been told I was irrelevant, depressing, unnecessary. Hearing Tom say the opposite with the evidence laid out in front of him reminded me I wasn't losing my mind. We went through everything together: the mortgage, the tuition checks, the loan agreement for the kitchen remodel. Tom organized them into binders, labeling each one. He even drew up a ledger showing the total amount I had invested in my son's life. When I saw the final number, it nearly made me sick. It wasn't just thousands, it was hundreds of thousands chipped away over decades. "Do you realize what you've done?" Tom asked. "You gave away your retirement, your security, all to make sure they were comfortable, and they've turned around and spat in your face." I nodded, swallowing the bitterness rising in my throat. I thought that was my job, to give no matter what. He shook his head. "A father gives his children a foundation. You don't let them build their entire castle on your back. That's not love, John. That's exploitation." The word hit hard, exploitation. I had never allowed myself to call it that. But hearing it from him, I knew he was right. And that's when Tom did something I didn't expect. He leaned forward, tapped the pile of documents and said, "You don't have to take this lying down. You've got leverage, real leverage. If you want to pull the plug on their lifestyle, you can. I'll help you." Those words lit a fire in me, not just because of the promise of action, but because for the first time in years, someone was standing beside me. I wasn't fighting this alone. Over the next week, Tom came by almost every day. We drank coffee at my kitchen table while he helped me sort, staple, and organize the files. He explained which documents were most important, which could be used in court if it came to that, which ones were indisputable. He showed me how to lock down my accounts, how to stop automatic transfers, how to freeze any further payments. "You've been the invisible lifeline they never acknowledged," he said. "Now it's time to cut the cord." There were moments when doubt crept back in, when I worried that maybe I was being too harsh, that maybe I should just forgive and forget. Each time Tom reminded me of Thanksgiving night. "They didn't just forget to thank you, John. They kicked you out. They mocked you. They erased you. If you let that stand, they'll never learn." He was right. Together we built a plan. Quiet, methodical, not a scene, not a confrontation in the heat of anger, but a slow and steady tightening of the rope. First freeze the accounts, then recall the loans, then stop paying the bills they thought were magically taken care of. Piece by piece, their independence would collapse until they were forced to face the truth. Every night after Tom left, I sat with the binders on my lap and felt something I hadn't felt in years: strength. My silence had given me control, but Tom's presence gave me confidence. He was my witness, my ally, my reminder that I wasn't crazy and I wasn't alone. Sometimes all it takes is one person to see you clearly when everyone else has turned their back. Kelly thought she had erased me from the story. Mark thought he could pretend I had never carried him. But Tom reminded me of something important. I still had the pen in my hand. And soon I was going to rewrite the ending. Black Friday came like it always did. Lines of shoppers outside department stores, news anchors buzzing about sales, credit cards swiping nonstop across the country. But for me, it wasn't about televisions or appliances. It was about timing. Tom and I had spent the past week preparing, and everything was in place. Every account they depended on, every loan I had co-signed, every quiet transfer I had been making to keep them afloat. Those lifelines were severed. It was like cutting power to a house in the middle of winter. Suddenly, everything they took for granted would go dark. That morning, I woke early. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the table, the binders of proof stacked neatly beside me. For once I didn't feel heavy with shame or bitterness. I felt calm, focused, like a man who had been carrying a load for too long and was finally setting it down. At 10 a.m. my phone buzzed. It was Mark. I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, Kelly called. I let it ring. By noon, there were 6 missed calls and 2 voicemails. My silence was louder than any answer I could have given. Then, around 1 p.m., I picked up when Mark called again. His voice was tight, panicked. "Dad, something's wrong. Our credit cards aren't working. The bank says the mortgage payment bounced. Kelly's debit card got declined at the mall. What's going on?" I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence hang before answering. I stopped paying. There was a pause on the line, followed by his disbelieving laugh. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," I said evenly. "I stopped paying. The accounts, the transfers, the mortgage. You wanted independence? You've got it now." His voice rose frantic. "Dad, you can't do that. We have bills. We have the kids. You should have thought of that before you told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving," I interrupted. My voice was steady, not angry, just final. "You told me I was depressing. You made sure everyone knew I didn't belong. So now you'll see what life looks like without me." I could hear Kelly in the background, her voice sharp and shrill. "Ask him if he's insane. He can't just do this. Everything's in our name now." I almost laughed. Everything in their name? Not quite. "You might want to look at the mortgage documents again," I said. "Or the kitchen loan agreement you both signed. Or the co-signed car loans. My name isn't gone. You just chose to forget it." Mark went quiet. The weight of the truth was sinking in. "Dad, please," he said finally, his tone shifting. Less angry now, more desperate. "We'll talk about this. Just turn it back on. Give us some time." I thought about the years I had given them. Decades of time. Time from my own life, stolen so they could live comfortably. "No," I said. "I already gave you more time than I had to give. Now it's yours to manage." Kelly's voice cut through the line again, high-pitched and furious. "This is financial abuse. You can't just pull the rug out from under us like this. We have a family to support." I let her rant, then answered calmly. "Funny. You didn't think it was abuse when you let me pay for everything without recognition. You didn't think it was abuse when you told me I was depressing and kicked me out of my own family's holiday. You thought I was irrelevant. Well, irrelevant doesn't pay your bills." The silence on the line was deafening. For once, they had no clever spin, no false story to cover the truth. Later that afternoon, I heard from Tom. He had gotten a call from the bank as well. My withdrawal of support had set off a chain reaction. Payments missed, accounts flagged, their spending habits crashing against the hard wall of reality. The life they flaunted, the house they bragged about, the security they took for granted, it was all crumbling. That evening my doorbell rang. It was Mark. He stood on my porch, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man in control, and more like the boy who used to come to me for help. "Dad," he said quietly, "please, can we just talk about this?" I stepped outside, leaving the door half closed behind me. I didn't invite him in. "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "You made your choice when you let her shut me out. You thought I was just the old man in the corner dragging you down. You were wrong. I was the one holding you up." His eyes filled with something between regret and panic. "We didn't mean it like that. You know how Kelly gets. She didn't." I cut him off. "Don't blame her. You stood there and let it happen. That was your house, your table, your family, and you let me walk away humiliated. Now you can live with the life you said you built on your own." He tried again, his voice breaking this time. "Dad, we have kids. Think about them." I did think about them, often. They were the only reason I had endured so much for so long. But children also needed to learn that actions have consequences. "I am thinking about them," I said. "And maybe it's time they saw the truth about their parents. The world doesn't hand you comfort. It comes at a price. I paid that price for years. Now it's your turn." For a long moment, he just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, he turned and walked back to his car. I watched the taillights fade into the distance, my heart heavy but steady. This wasn't rage, this wasn't revenge, this was justice. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. But today my silence had spoken louder than any Thanksgiving toast, louder than any false story they had told. The confrontation was complete, not with shouts, not with fists, but with the quiet withdrawal of everything they had built their lives on. And as the world around them began to collapse, I sat back in my chair, calm at last, knowing the lesson had only just begun. The first wave of their panic came quickly. By the next morning my phone lit up with missed calls, voicemails, and frantic text messages. I didn't need to answer to know what they said. Their lives had been built on a web of assumptions and I had just cut the threads. Still, I listened to one of the voicemails, just to hear it. Kelly's voice, shrill and angry, spilled through the receiver. "John, this isn't funny. Do you have any idea what you've done? We were humiliated yesterday. Our cards didn't work. The store manager was looking at us like we were thieves. We had to leave a cart full of things behind. Everyone saw it. This is beyond cruel. Call me back right now and fix this." She was trembling with rage, but underneath it I could hear something else, fear. I set the phone down and smiled faintly. For years I had carried the weight of their comfort quietly and thanklessly. Now they were finally feeling the weight themselves. Later that afternoon I stepped outside to get the mail. My neighbor Mrs. Wilson was at her porch across the street. She gave me a look, half curious, half sympathetic. I knew she'd heard already. News like this traveled fast. A family that had strutted around with their big house and perfect image now exposed as struggling. It was the kind of gossip neighbors passed around with hushed voices and raised eyebrows. By evening I got another voicemail. This one was from Mark. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Dad, please, I'm begging you. I don't know what to do. The bank called me today about the mortgage. They said payments haven't cleared in months, and I thought you were still covering it. I didn't realize how much we depended on you. Please, can you at least give us time to figure things out? The kids, Dad, the kids don't understand what's happening." There it was, the admission. He didn't realize. He thought money just appeared, problems just disappeared. That life was somehow on autopilot because I kept it that way. Now the illusion was gone. The following day, Tom stopped by with his usual satchel of notes. He chuckled as he set down the latest letter from the bank. This one addressed to both me and Mark. "They're going to learn real quick how fragile their little empire is," he said. I nodded. They thought I was irrelevant. Now they can't go a day without feeling my absence. By Sunday, the shockwaves had fully hit. Their friends began whispering. Kelly had posted nothing on social media all weekend, which for her was a rarity. Normally, she was the first to flaunt new purchases, pictures of shopping hauls, dinners out, or the kids in brand new outfits. But with their cards frozen and their accounts drying up, there was nothing to brag about. Instead, the silence from her end was deafening. I imagined the conversations behind their closed doors, the fights, the blame, Kelly accusing Mark of not standing up to me, Mark defending himself by saying he never had control in the first place. Both of them circling around the truth but too proud to admit it. Without me, their life unraveled in an instant. On Monday morning I heard a knock at my door. I knew before opening who it would be. Mark stood there, his eyes tired, his shoulders slumped. He looked nothing like the confident man who had stood beside Kelly on Thanksgiving night. laughing as I walked away. He looked smaller, deflated. "Dad," he said quietly, "we're in trouble, real trouble." I didn't invite him inside. I leaned against the doorframe and waited. "We can't pay the mortgage. The bank's threatening foreclosure if we don't catch up. Kelly's furious, and the kid—" For a moment I almost felt pity, almost. But then I remembered the pie in my hands, her words like knives in my chest. "You're depressing. We don't need you here. You should have thought of that before you let her throw me out," I said. He shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. "She didn't mean it. She was stressed, you know how she gets. Please, Dad, you can't just let us sink like this." I raised an eyebrow. "Can't I?" The shock in his eyes told me everything. For years I had been the dependable one, the safety net, the man who always said yes no matter the cost. Now, for the first time, he was realizing that I had the power to say no. He tried again, his voice cracking. "Dad, I swear, I'll make it right. I'll talk to Kelly. We'll apologize. Just, please, don't let us lose the house." I let his words hang in the cold air between us. Then I shook my head slowly. "You were so quick to forget how that house came to be. Maybe losing it will remind you." He swallowed hard, his face pale, his hands trembling. I could see the shock settling deeper now, not just at the financial ruin looming over him, but at the reality that I was no longer the silent, compliant father he thought he could control. When he finally left, dragging his feet back to his car, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't revenge, this was revelation. For years they had convinced themselves I didn't matter. But now, with every missed payment, every declined card, every whisper from the community, the truth was crashing down around them. The shock was only beginning, and I had no intention of softening the blow. News moves fast in a small town, but it moves even faster when pride has been put on public display. By the Sunday after Thanksgiving, I could feel the air change. The same people who once nodded politely at me and then drifted toward my son's circle, now paused a little longer, their eyes searching my face for a story they had ignored for years. I noticed it first at the diner. The waitress who had poured my coffee on Thanksgiving night leaned on the counter when I came in and spoke in a low voice. "I heard there was trouble at the mall," she said. "I don't need the details, but I'm sorry for how they treated you." I did not give her a speech. I did not list numbers or wave papers. I said thank you and took the corner booth. She slipped a slice of pecan pie onto my table and said it was on the house. I let the gesture sit. Kindness felt unfamiliar after so much dismissal. On my way home, Mrs. Wilson waved me over from her porch. She looked like a woman rehearsing an apology. "I owe you one," she said. "I saw you in the car that night. I should have come out. I was afraid of making a scene." "You do not owe me anything," I answered. "You did not shut the door." She nodded, then glanced toward my son's street. "There is a lot of talk. People always believed that story about how they built everything themselves. Now folks are asking different questions. Questions have weight when they land in the right ears." By Monday morning I had a call from Pastor Ray at church. He asked me to stop by. When I walked into his office, he closed the door and folded his hands like a man bracing himself. "I heard what happened, John," he said. "I know you do not want attention, but I want you to know the church has your back. Gratitude is not a slogan, it is a practice." "I do not need a spotlight," I said. "I only need the truth to stand." He smiled and said that was the right order of things. That afternoon the bank made it official. A certified letter arrived addressed to me and to Mark, listing missed payments, a notice of default timelines, and a request to schedule a meeting. There is nothing dramatic about bank stationery, but it might as well have been a siren. Paper speaks clearly. People listen. Tom came by, and we read it together at the kitchen table. "They will try to spin this," he said. "They will say you ambushed them. You did not. The records show the dates. The dates show years." I nodded. "I will not argue with anyone. If they want to know, they can read." That choice turned out to matter. I did not post anything online. I did not corner anyone in a grocery aisle. I simply carried a plain folder when I ran errands. I did not open it unless someone asked me a direct question. The folder was enough. It let me speak without shouting. It let me refuse to be a rumor. At the hardware store, the owner, Jack, pulled me aside near the paint aisle. "Your boy used to tell folks he came up the hard way," he said. "We all thought he had grit. Turns out he had a good father." "He had both," I said. "One does not cancel the other." Jack sighed. "Still takes a man to say it that way." The shift reached the school faster than I expected. A mother from my granddaughter's class stopped me in the parking lot. "I am not taking sides," she began, which always means someone is taking sides. "But my daughter said your granddaughter looked worried in class today. If she needs rides or help with anything, we are close by." I thanked her. I told her children do not need the burden of adult pride. She agreed. Later that week, the HOA board circulated a maintenance notice to my son's address and copied me. since my name was on the mortgage. It was routine, a warning about a fee and lawn care. But the letter traveled in the neighborhood chat. People saw what they had not seen before. The man they called irrelevant was on the deed they admired. That is how myths break. Not with a roar, with a line item. Kelly went quiet online. For a woman who narrated brunch, silence was a broadcast. Her friends filled the gap with guesses. Some were kind, some were not. None of them called me a liar. There is a respect that grows when you do not chase it. On Thursday, I went to the church pantry to help stock boxes. I have been doing that for years. A young volunteer I had not met before loaded potatoes into a bin and said, without looking at me, "My granddad raised me. He never asked for thanks. I wish I had given it sooner." I said, "There is still time." He smiled and kept working. That evening the soccer coach called. My grandson had missed practice. That is not like him. The coach did not ask about money or drama. He asked if the boy needed cleats or a ride. Community is not a press release. It is a person deciding to show up. By Friday morning, a neighbor who used to ignore me showed up with a casserole and a shaky apology. "I believed what I wanted to believe," she said. "A tidy story is easier than a true one." "It is," I said. "It also breaks faster." In the middle of that quiet tide, the loudest voice finally cracked. Kelly posted a long message about being overwhelmed, about feeling attacked, about how people should not judge families from the outside. For once, the comments did not cheer. A few were gracious. Most were blunt. One person wrote, "Respect begins at your own door," and the likes piled up under it. I did not like or share anything. I set my phone face down and cleaned my kitchen. There is power in refusing to fight where noise is rewarded. The call that mattered came that afternoon. It was the bank manager, a woman named Harris. Her tone was neutral, the way professionals sound when the facts do the talking. "Mr. Carter, we have both parties listed on the mortgage," she said. "We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss options. Restructuring is possible if the responsible parties agree to terms." "Responsible parties," I repeated. "That is the phrase that has been missing." "Yes, sir," she said. "Can you come in next Friday at 2 o'clock? "I can," I said. She paused. "Shall I invite your son and his wife as well?" "You may invite my son," I said. "His wife is not on the note." When I hung up, I stood at the window and watched the late light slide across the street. People passed by with dogs and mail and small talk. No one pointed. No one whispered. The noise had burned off. What remained was simpler. A man who had given more than he should, and a town that had finally adjusted its view. Tom called to check in. I told him about the meeting. He said he would come and sit in the lobby. He does not like banks, but he likes friends more. "Next Friday," he said. "That is the day the story stops being a story. It becomes a ledger," I said. He laughed. "Even better." I set the phone down and put the bank letter in my folder. The church pantry shift was tomorrow. The soccer coach still needed a schedule. Life did not pause for our family's lesson. It pressed on. The community had shifted. Not to my side, not against theirs, but toward truth. Respect had returned to its rightful shape. That was enough for now. The meeting was on the calendar. The papers were in order. And there was one more document in my desk that no one had seen yet. I locked the drawer and looked at the clock, counting the days until 2 o'clock on Friday. The bank meeting came faster than I expected. All week I carried the folder with me like armor. Every document neatly arranged. Every signature ready to speak where I would not have to. It was not nerves I felt. It was anticipation. For the first time in years, I was not walking into a room begging to be heard. I was walking in holding the truth. Tom came with me. As promised, he sat in the lobby with his satchel and a crossword puzzle while I walked into the conference room. The manager, Miss Harris, was already there, her posture calm but businesslike. A moment later, Mark arrived. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was crooked, his shirt wrinkled, and the confidence he once carried like a shield was gone. He avoided my eyes at first, fumbling with his papers. "Mr. Carter," Miss Harris began addressing me. "Thank you for coming. As you know, the mortgage is in both your names. We've had several months of missed payments. We need to discuss how to proceed." I nodded and opened my folder, sliding the relevant papers across the table. "I am fully aware of the account status. The missed payments were intentional. My financial support has ended." Mark's head snapped up. His face flushed. "Dad, you can't just announce that here. We'll lose the house." I looked him straight in the eye, calm and steady. "It's not just your house, Mark. My name is on the deed. My money built it, and for years you let people believe it was all yours. That ends today." Miss Harris cleared her throat gently, trying to diffuse the tension. "We have options: loan restructuring, refinancing, if both parties agree." "I don't agree," I said firmly. Not until there is accountability. Mark stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words. Finally he leaned forward, his voice low, almost pleading. Dad, please. The kids don't deserve this. They need stability. We can work this out. Just give me more time. It was the first time in years I'd heard humility in his tone. It almost moved me. Almost. I folded my hands. Stability is something I bought for you year after year. I gave up my retirement, my health, my peace of mind, to make sure your children never knew what instability looked like, and you repaid me by letting your wife throw me out of Thanksgiving dinner. He winced, shame flickering across his face. I should have stopped her. I know that. She was wrong. She was, I said. But you were worse. You stood there. You let her. You told yourself it was easier that way. The silence stretched. He looked down at his papers, unable to deny it. Miss Harris spoke again, carefully. So, what outcome are you hoping for, Mr. Carter? I sat back, my voice even. I want the bank to proceed as though my support has permanently ended. If my son wants to keep the house, he must prove he can pay for it without me. If he cannot, then the foreclosure process should continue. Mark's eyes went wide. Dad, no, you can't do this. We'll lose everything. The kids will suffer. Please, I'm begging you. There it was, the begging I had waited years to hear. But instead of bringing me joy, it brought a strange sense of clarity. I didn't want his begging. I wanted his respect, and if respect could only come through loss, then so be it. You've lived under the illusion that you built this life, I said. Now you get the chance to prove it, or lose it. Either way, the truth comes out. Mark's hands shook as he rubbed his face. Dad, we'll change. I'll make it right. Just don't let this happen, please. Behind those words I could still hear Kelly. I could hear her fury at losing status, her fear at being exposed, her hatred of me growing by the hour. She had likely pushed him to come here, hoping he could soften me. But she hadn't come herself. Pride wouldn't let her. I leaned forward. It isn't about apologies. It isn't about promises. It's about responsibility. And for once in your life, Mark, you're going to carry it without leaning on me. He sat back, defeated, his eyes glistening. The man who once dismissed me as a shadow was now realizing I had been the foundation all along. The meeting ended with Miss Harris scheduling a follow-up to review whether Mark could qualify for restructuring without me. I walked out of that room lighter than I had in years. In the lobby, Tom folded his crossword and stood. Well, he asked. They begged, I said simply. Tom studied my face, and I told them no. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Tom put a hand on my shoulder. Good. Sometimes the only way people learn is when the safety net disappears. That night, I got another voicemail. This time from Kelly herself. Her voice was brittle, controlled, but I could hear the cracks. John, listen, I may have said some things that were harsh. I was overwhelmed. But this is too far. You're destroying your own grandchildren's lives to make a point. We can't fix this unless you meet us halfway. Please, think about the kids. We're willing to talk it over. Just, please. I let the voicemail play twice before deleting it. She wasn't apologizing. She was bargaining. She wasn't acknowledging the years of sacrifice, the humiliation, the erasure. She was trying to claw her way back into control. But the days of me folding under pressure were over. The reversal was complete. The man they thought was powerless, irrelevant, a burden, now held all the power, and they knew it. The begging would continue. The bargaining would grow louder, but for once I was not the one who had to bend. For the first time in decades I stood tall. Closure doesn't come from shouting. It doesn't come from winning an argument or forcing someone to admit you were right. Closure comes when you stop needing anything from the people who hurt you. That's what I realized as the days passed after the bank meeting. Mark kept calling. Kelly left more voicemails. Some were angry, some desperate, some dressed up as polite let's move forward messages. None of them mattered anymore. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Their voices no longer carried the weight they once did. For the first time in years, I felt free from their grip. One morning I decided to take a drive past their house. Not to gloat, not to torment myself, but because I needed to see it with clear eyes. It was a cold December day. The yard that once looked pristine was covered in leaves, the grass long and patchy. I noticed a for sale sign staked into the lawn, swaying gently in the wind. My son's car was in the driveway, hood propped open like he was trying to fix something himself instead of taking it to a shop. There were no Christmas decorations, no lights strung along the roofline, no wreath on the door. For years Kelly had gone all out during the holidays, determined to prove their house was the brightest on the block. Now the windows were dark. I pulled over across the street and sat for a while. Neighbors walked past and gave me nods they hadn't given before. Not pitying nods, not smug ones, just recognition. They knew now. They knew the truth. After a few minutes I started the engine again. I didn't need to linger. The for sale sign said more than any confrontation ever could. That house wasn't mine anymore. Not really. It had always been theirs to maintain or lose. I had only delayed the inevitable by holding them up for so long. Now they were facing the weight of their own choices, and it was no longer my responsibility to carry it. When I got home, I walked straight to the kitchen and opened the trash bin. On top sat an empty pie tin I had used the night before. I stared at it for a moment, remembering the pie I'd carried to their door on Thanksgiving, the pie that wasn't welcome. I thought about throwing it away without ceremony, but then I picked it up, washed it clean, and placed it back in the cabinet where my wife used to keep her baking dishes. It struck me then. I didn't need to bury her memory in their cruelty, her recipes, her traditions. They belonged to me, to the parts of the family who still cared, not to the people who pushed me out. That night, I baked another pie, not for them, but for myself, for the neighbors who had begun treating me differently, for the church pantry volunteers, for Tom, who had stood by me when no one else did. I delivered slices quietly the next day, leaving one wrapped plate on each doorstep. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't a statement, it was closure, the act of reclaiming something that had been used to humiliate me and turning it back into something that gave me peace. A week later, Tom and I went fishing at the old lake. We hadn't done that in years. My knees made it harder to move around and his back ached from sitting too long, but the two of us sat in folding chairs on the bank with lines cast into the still water. "You seem lighter," Tom said after a while. "I am," I answered. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel guilt for cutting them off, but I don't. I feel done, finished." He nodded. "Because you finally stopped giving them what they didn't deserve." I watched the ripples on the water and let that sink in. He was right. My silence, my decision to step away, wasn't cruelty. It was justice. It was balance. It was me reclaiming the life I still had left to live. As winter deepened, I noticed something else. The begging and bargaining from Mark and Kelly grew quieter. They weren't fixed. Not by a long shot, but they were starting to understand that I wasn't going to swoop in and rescue them anymore. And the less they pulled at me, the more I felt the weight of their hold slipping away. Closure isn't loud. It doesn't need applause or acknowledgement. It's the quiet that settles in when you finally stop reaching for a hand that never reaches back. One Sunday after church, I walked to the cemetery and stood by my wife's grave. I brushed the snow off the headstone and set a small piece of pie on the ground, wrapped in foil. "I think you'd be proud," I said softly. "I finally listened to you. I stopped emptying myself. I stopped letting them take." The wind stirred, sharp but not bitter. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was carrying her memory as a burden. I felt like I was carrying it as a shield. Walking back to the car, I knew something with finality. I no longer needed their apologies. I no longer needed them to recognize my worth. My dignity had never been theirs to give or take. It had always been mine. When I reached home, I unlocked the drawer where I'd kept all the binders. I pulled them out one last time, ran my hand across the covers, then slid them back in. The proof existed, the leverage existed, but I didn't need to keep staring at it anymore. I had already won, not by crushing them, but by refusing to let them define me. That was closure, not revenge, not pride, just peace. And that peace was worth more than every dollar I had ever given them. People think closure comes when you hear the words "I'm sorry." They imagine an apology as some grand unlocking of chains. But the truth is, apologies often never come, and when they do, they're usually wrapped in excuses or spoken too late to matter. What I learned was that dignity doesn't need an apology to be restored. It needs recognition, quiet, steady recognition, sometimes from the unlikeliest places. I never got the apology from Kelly, not once. She never called and admitted I was cruel. "I disrespected you. I should have treated you better." Instead, her messages shifted from outrage to desperation to silence. That silence said enough. She knew what she'd done, but pride wouldn't let her say it out loud. Mark wasn't much better. He tried, in his way, to soften things. "Dad, you know we didn't mean it like that. We were stressed." Or, "Kelly has a sharp tongue. Don't hold it against us." They weren't apologies. They were excuses. I listened once or twice, then stopped picking up altogether. Words were cheap, and I was done living on cheap words. But something else happened, something I hadn't expected. The community began to recognize me in ways my own son never had. At church, people who once brushed past me started stopping to shake my hand. One man I barely knew said, "You've always been there, John." I think some of us forgot that. I won't forget again. It wasn't about money or sacrifice. It was about presence. They saw me. The pastor mentioned me during a sermon one Sunday, speaking about quiet givers who never ask for recognition, but without whom families and communities would crumble. He didn't use my name, but I knew. And so did half the congregation, judging by the way a few heads turned in my direction. Even at the grocery store, little things changed. The cashier, a young man with tattoos up his arm, called me sir and carried my bags out to the car. The neighbor kids started waving when I walked past, no longer repeating whatever dismissive words they'd heard at home. Respect was creeping back, not because I demanded it, but because the truth had finally floated to the surface, undeniable, and maybe most important of all, my grandchildren began to look at me differently. One Saturday, my grandson came over on his bike. He stood at the end of my driveway, helmet still on, shuffling his feet like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. I waved him over. "Grandpa," he said quietly. "Mom and Dad fight a lot now, but I know you help us." I heard them talking. I crouched down, meeting his eyes. "What matters is you know I love you. No matter what happens with the grown-ups, you'll always have me." He nodded, and I could see something shift in him. Respect, maybe, or just the beginning of understanding. Either way, it meant more than 1,000 apologies ever could. That same week, my granddaughter handed me a drawing she'd made at school. It was of a house, a family standing outside, and me drawn bigger than the others, holding what looked like a hammer. At the top, in shaky letters, she had written, "Grandpa builds everything." I nearly cried when I saw it, not because it erased the pain of the past, but because it showed me something important. The next generation saw me, even if the last one had tried to erase me. Recognition doesn't always come from where you want it. Sometimes it comes sideways, through neighbors, through children, through community, and sometimes it comes only from yourself. One evening, Tom and I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low. He had a beer in his hand. I had my usual tea. He looked at me and said, "You don't look like a man carrying a grudge. You look like a man who set it down." "I did," I said. "They never apologized. Maybe they never will. But I don't need it. I know the truth. And so does everyone else now." Tom nodded. "That's enough." And he was right. It was enough. I realized then that I had spent too much of my life waiting for apologies, waiting for thanks, waiting for recognition from people who were too wrapped up in themselves to give it. That waiting had been my real prison, but once I stopped needing it, I was free. Mark and Kelly still struggled. They were trying to sell the house. Rumors said they'd have to move into a rental across town, something smaller, humbler. Part of me wondered if they'd blame me forever for that. Maybe they would, but it no longer mattered. Their opinion of me had no power anymore, because the truth had been restored. My dignity had been restored, not by their words, but by the undeniable facts and by the quiet recognition of those around me. The final proof came one afternoon at the diner. The waitress, who'd always been kind, poured me a coffee and said, "You know, you've got more people in this town who respect you than you probably realize. Folks are talking, but not the way they used to. They see you now." I thanked her and took a slow sip of coffee. It tasted different, cleaner somehow. Not because the coffee had changed, but because I had. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need to be welcomed back to their table. I didn't even need them to admit they were wrong. I had my dignity back, and that was enough. The day I decided to stop looking backward was the day I finally felt young again. Not in my body. My knees still ached and my back still protested when I got out of bed, but in my spirit. For too long I had lived trapped in bitterness, replaying slights, waiting for apologies that never came. That weight had aged me more than time ever could. But once I laid it down, I found something I thought was gone forever: freedom. I began to shape a new routine. Mornings were no longer filled with waiting for phone calls that never brought anything but frustration. Instead, I brewed coffee, read the paper, and then walked to the park. I started talking with people I'd passed by for years but never really noticed: the man who jogged every morning, the woman who walked 3 dogs, the young father pushing a stroller. Little by little, I wove myself back into the fabric of the community, not as a silent shadow, but as a man with his head held high. One Saturday, I volunteered at the church pantry again. I'd been helping there off and on for years, but this time felt different. Before, I had always rushed through it, half distracted by worries about what my son needed, or what bill might be waiting for me at home. Now, I was present. I loaded boxes of canned goods, stacked bread, handed out milk, and looked people in the eye when I wished them well. And you know what? It filled me up more than any Thanksgiving meal ever had. I realized then that my new path didn't have to be about punishing the past. It could be about building something for the future. That's when I decided to focus on my grandchildren, not through their parents. Mark and Kelly no longer controlled that bridge, but directly in small and quiet ways. I opened a savings account in each of their names. Nothing flashy, just a start, a seed. I arranged with the bank that every month, a portion of my pension would be deposited for their future: college, a first car, maybe even a home one day. Things built not on lies but on truth. When I saw them, I didn't talk about money. I talked about values. I told my grandson that being a man wasn't about how loud you could talk but how steady you could stand when it mattered. I told my granddaughter that strength and kindness could live in the same heart, and the world would try to take both from her if she let it. I didn't know if they fully understood, but I knew the words would stay with them the way my father's words had stayed with me. Tom was part of this new path too. We fished more often, sometimes catching nothing but still leaving the lake with lighter hearts. We shared meals, laughed at old stories, even talked about taking a short trip down south once spring came. He reminded me that friendship is another kind of legacy, one built not through obligation but through loyalty freely given. And then there was my wife's memory. For so long it had been tied up with grief and sacrifice, as if honoring her meant continuing to empty myself for others. But as I baked her pies and passed them out to neighbors, I began to see her legacy differently. It wasn't about me suffering in silence. It was about me carrying forward her spirit of generosity, but on my own terms this time. I didn't need a full table of family to keep her alive. I only needed to live in a way she would have been proud of. The house where Mark and Kelly once lived eventually sold. I drove past it one last time when the moving trucks pulled away. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel sorrow. I felt distance, like watching the end of a story that no longer belonged to me. Their choices were theirs. My life was mine. The future stretched before me in a way it hadn't in years. Not endless, not guaranteed. At my age nothing is, but clear. Clear enough to know I had more left to give, but not in the same destructive way I had before. This time I would give wisely, carefully. One evening my grandson sat beside me on the porch, legs swinging. He looked up and asked, "Grandpa, are you sad we don't all live together anymore?" I smiled and put an arm around him. "No, son. I'm glad we have time together like this. Families don't always stay under the same roof. What matters is the love that stays with you, no matter where you go." He nodded, satisfied, and leaned against me. In that moment I knew my legacy wasn't broken. It was simply moving forward in a different shape. I may never get the apologies I once thought I needed, but I no longer crave them. My story doesn't end with bitterness or with the humiliation of a holiday gone wrong. It ends with a man reclaiming his dignity, finding peace in his community, building a future for his grandchildren, and carrying forward the best of the past without letting the worst define him. As I sit here now, pen in hand, tea cooling beside me, I can say it plainly. They tried to erase me. They tried to convince themselves I was nothing more than a burden, but in the end, I was the foundation they stood on, and when I stepped back, they fell. That isn't tragedy. That isn't revenge. That's justice. And with justice comes peace.